The morning light streamed through the tall windows of the county courthouse, casting long shadows across the freshly mopped marble floor. Anthony had arrived at 5 a.m., as he did every weekday for the past 9 years. The quiet early hours were his favorite, just him, his thoughts, and the peaceful emptiness of the grand building before the chaos of the day began. At 42, Anthony's face showed the quiet dignity of a man who had seen much of life but chosen to respond with grace rather than bitterness. His hands, strong and calloused from years of physical work, moved methodically as he pushed his cleaning cart from room to room. The courthouse staff knew him only as the reliable janitor who kept to himself, nodded politely in the hallways, and somehow managed to make the old building shine. What they didn't know was that those same hands that scrubbed toilets and polished floors also turned the pages of law books late into the night. They didn't see the small apartment where every available space was filled with carefully organized legal texts, case studies, and journals. They didn't know about the law degree, hidden in a simple frame in his bedroom, earned through 6 years of night classes while working full-time. "Morning, Anthony," called the security guard as he passed through the main entrance. "Going to be a busy one today. That big chemical company case is starting." Anthony nodded. "I heard about that. The Westbrook neighborhood situation, right?" "That's the one. Judge Hartman's courtroom. Better make sure it's extra spotless, nah," the guard chuckled. Judge Richard Hartman. Anthony had cleaned his chambers for years. He'd observed the judge's proceedings whenever possible, standing quietly in the back of the courtroom during his breaks, absorbing everything. Judge Hartman was known for 3 things: his razor-sharp legal mind, his immaculate appearance, and his thinly veiled contempt for those he considered beneath his station. By mid-morning, the courthouse buzzed with activity. Lawyers in expensive suits rushed through hallways clutching coffee cups and briefcases. Court reporters and clerks hurried to their positions, and Anthony moved quietly among them, invisible as he emptied trash cans and wiped down surfaces. The Westbrook case had brought reporters and community members to the courthouse. Anthony recognized many faces from his own neighborhood: the elderly woman who ran the corner store, the young father who coached Little League, the high school teacher who lived 2 doors down from him. Their neighborhood had suffered for years from mysterious illnesses, with unusually high rates of respiratory problems and cancer. The lawsuit claimed that Chemtech Industries had been illegally dumping toxic waste, poisoning the groundwater. As Anthony cleaned near Judge Hartman's chambers, during the lunch recess, he couldn't help overhearing a conversation between the judge and his clerk. "The precedent in Carlton versus Midwest manufacturing clearly doesn't apply here," Judge Hartman was saying, his voice carrying that distinctive tone of someone who believed his every word was invaluable. "The plaintiff's attorney is grasping at straws." Anthony paused in his work. He knew the Carlton case well. He'd studied it thoroughly in his environmental law class. The judge was mistaken. The Carlton precedent absolutely applied, but through a more recent ruling that had expanded its scope. For a moment, Anthony debated staying silent. It wasn't his place to speak. He was the janitor, the invisible man. But these were his neighbors whose lives were at stake. If the judge misapplied the precedent, it could damage their case irreparably. Gathering his courage, Anthony knocked gently on the open door. "Excuse me, Your Honor." Judge Hartman looked up, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Yes? What is it?" "I apologize for interrupting, sir, but I couldn't help overhearing about the Carlton case," Anthony said, keeping his voice respectful. "There was actually a ruling last year in the Fourth Circuit that expanded the Carlton precedent. Henderson v. East Chem Industries. It specifically addressed groundwater contamination from chemical plants in residential areas. The silence that followed was deafening. The judge's clerk looked up from her papers, eyes wide with surprise. Judge Hartman's expression shifted from annoyance to disbelief, then to something harder to read. "I'm sorry," the judge said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I didn't realize we had a legal scholar on the janitorial staff." He turned to his clerk with a theatrical gesture. "Perhaps we should all throw away our law degrees and just mop floors instead?" The clerk gave an uncomfortable laugh. "Tell me," Judge Hartman continued, standing to his full height and straightening. His robes. Where exactly did you get your law degree? The University of Bathroom Cleaning? Or perhaps the prestigious Mop Bucket Law School? His voice echoed in the chamber. Two attorneys walking by the open door stopped to listen, smirking at the judge's comments. Anthony stood perfectly still, his face betraying nothing despite the heat of shame rising in his chest. 9 years of perfect service in this building, and this was the first time he'd ever spoken out of turn? No, Your Honor, he replied quietly. I just read a lot in my spare time. Well then, the judge said, walking over to tower above Anthony. Perhaps when you've earned the right to wear a suit instead of a uniform, you can offer legal opinions in my courthouse. Until then, I suggest you stick to what you know. The attorneys in the doorway chuckled. One whispered something to the other that made them both laugh harder. Now, Judge Hartman said with a dismissive wave, I believe there's a spill in the public restroom that requires your expertise. Anthony nodded once, his expression giving away nothing of the storm inside him. Yes, Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption. He turned and pushed his cart out of the chambers, past the snickering attorneys, his back straight and his eyes forward. The weight of the law degree in his apartment seemed to grow heavier with each step. What none of them saw was the determination that flashed in his eyes when he was alone in the hallway. They didn't see his hand tighten around the handle of his cart, or the way he took a deep breath and thought of his neighbors, his community, who deserved better. As he worked through the afternoon, Anthony's mind was already turning over the details of the case, examining angles and strategies. He had studied too long, worked too hard to be defeated by one moment of humiliation. Perhaps when you've earned the right to wear a suit, the judge had said. Anthony allowed himself a small smile as he finished his shift. Little did Judge Hartman know there was already a carefully pressed suit hanging in Anthony's closet at home, waiting for the right moment. And Anthony was a patient man. He knew that timing was everything, in cleaning, in law, and in justice. Anthony's small apartment was nothing like the grand courthouse where he spent his days. The living room walls were lined with bookshelves he'd built himself, filled not with decorative items but with carefully organized law books. Some were worn from repeated reading, their pages marked with color-coded sticky notes. A modest desk sat in the corner, topped with a second-hand laptop and neat stacks of papers. When he arrived home that evening after the humiliating encounter with Judge Hartman, Anthony placed his keys in the small bowl by the door and stood for a moment, letting the quiet of his space wash over him. The anger and shame he'd held at bay all day threatened to surface, but he pushed it down. Emotions wouldn't help his neighbors. Knowledge would. He changed out of his janitor's uniform and made a simple dinner of rice and beans. As he ate, he reviewed his notes on the Chemtech case. The company had been operating in their area for over 20 years, and for at least half that time, people in the Westbrook neighborhood had been getting sick. Children with asthma, elders with unexplained cancers, young adults with rare autoimmune diseases. Anthony had been collecting newspaper clippings, medical studies, and legal cases for years. It wasn't just academic for him. His own uncle had died of a rare lung disease after 30 years of living just 2 blocks from the plant. After dinner, he pulled out his most treasured possession, a framed law degree from State University. He had earned it over 6 long years of night classes, working during the day and studying until the early morning hours. He'd graduated with honors, passed the bar exam on his first try, and even had offers from 2 law firms. But Anthony had declined those offers. He had a plan that required patience, a plan that kept him cleaning floors at the courthouse instead of arguing cases there. Not yet, he had told himself, not until he understood how the system truly worked from the inside. Now, looking at the degree in his hands, he wondered if today's humiliation was a sign that it was time to stop waiting. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was May, a public defender he'd met at the courthouse library during one of his lunch breaks. Unlike most of the lawyers who never noticed him, May had spotted him reading complex legal texts and struck up a conversation. Over the past year, they'd developed a friendship based on their shared passion for justice. "I heard what happened with Hartman today," she said when he answered. "Word travels fast in that building," Anthony sighed. "It was my fault. I spoke out of turn." No, May's voice was firm. He was wrong to treat you that way, and from what I hear, you were right about the Henderson precedent. Doesn't matter if I'm right. Not when I'm wearing a janitor's uniform. But that's just it, Anthony. It shouldn't matter what you're wearing. The law is the law, and that precedent could help those Westbrook families. There was a pause before she continued. Why are you still hiding who you are? You passed the bar 3 years ago. You could be practicing law instead of cleaning toilets. Anthony finished with a small smile. It's complicated, May. Try me. Anthony walked to his window, looking out at the neighborhood he'd grown up in. The streetlights were coming on, casting pools of yellow light on the cracked sidewalks. In the distance, the Chemtech plant's smokestacks were visible against the darkening sky. My father worked as a janitor his whole life, he said quietly. He cleaned offices for people who never bothered to learn his name, but he watched everything, learned everything. He used to tell me that people say things in front of the cleaning staff that they'd never say in front of others, because to them we're invisible. He turned back to his bookshelves. When I started at the courthouse, I realized he was right. I've learned more about how the law really works by being invisible in that building than I ever could have as a lawyer fresh out of school. But now, you've learned enough, May insisted. The Westbrook case needs someone who understands both the law and the community. Their lawyer, Thompson, is good but overworked, and he doesn't have your connection to the neighborhood. Anthony thought about the faces he'd seen in the courthouse that morning, his neighbors looking worried and out of place in the grand building. They were up against Chemtech's team of high-priced attorneys who arrived in luxury cars and wore suits that cost more than Anthony made in a month. There's power in being underestimated, he said finally. And timing is everything. Well, your timing might need to speed up, May replied. Thompson isn't doing well. The stress of this case on top of his regular caseload. I'm worried about him. After they hung up, Anthony stayed up late into the night, reviewing everything he knew about the Westbrook case. He pulled out files he'd been collecting for years. Newspaper articles about mysterious fish kills in the creek behind the plant, county health department statistics showing elevated rates of certain diseases in their zip code, property records, revealing that Chemtech had quietly bought several lots near the plant when families moved out after getting sick. Around midnight, his phone buzzed with a news alert. He opened it to see Judge Hartman's face on the screen. The article reported that the judge had been assigned to a prestigious judicial conference the same week the Westbrook case was scheduled to conclude. Legal observers noted that it was a sign of Hartman's rising prominence and a stepping stone to a possible federal appointment. Anthony studied the judge's smiling face in the photo. The pieces were falling into place in his mind. Hartman had political ambitions. The Westbrook case could affect those ambitions, especially if it resulted in a large corporation being held accountable. The judge's dismissal of the Henderson precedent made more sense now. The next morning, Anthony arrived at the courthouse even earlier than usual. As he mopped the floors outside courtroom 3, he noticed Thompson, the Westbrook family's lawyer, sitting alone on a bench. The man looked exhausted, his skin ashen, his hand slightly shaking as he reviewed his notes. Anthony finished his section and then, after a moment's hesitation, approached the lawyer. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "I just wanted to say that a lot of people from Westbrook are grateful for what you're doing." Thompson looked up, surprised. "Thank you, it's been challenging." Anthony nodded. "I live there too. My whole family has been in that neighborhood for generations." "Then you know what we're up against," Thompson said with a weary smile. "These corporations have endless resources, and they're betting we'll give up before they run out of legal maneuvers." "I heard you mention the Carlton precedent yesterday," Anthony said carefully. "Have you looked into the Henderson ruling from last year? It might strengthen your argument." Thompson's tired eyes sharpened with interest. "Henderson? I don't think I'm familiar with that one. Fourth Circuit. Similar fact pattern to our situation. I could find the case number for you if it would help." The lawyer was fully focused on Anthony now, taking in his janitor's uniform with new eyes. "Yes, that would be very helpful. Thank you." "Anthony," he supplied. "Anthony Wilson." As he walked away to continue his rounds, Anthony felt a shift in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. Maybe it was time to stop watching from the shadows. Maybe his neighbors couldn't afford for him to wait any longer. The courtroom hummed with tension on the third day of the Chemtech trial. Anthony moved quietly along the back wall, emptying trash bins while keeping his ears open. The company's lawyers had brought in a scientist who was testifying that the chemicals found in Westbrook's water supply weren't harmful at the detected levels. "In your expert opinion, Dr. Reynolds," the lead corporate attorney asked, "could these chemicals cause the health issues reported in the neighborhood?" The scientist adjusted his glasses. "Not at these concentrations. The levels are below EPA guidelines." Anthony noticed Thompson scribbling notes furiously, looking increasingly frustrated. The lawyer had been coughing throughout the morning, and his face appeared flushed with fever. During the mid-morning recess, Anthony found Thompson in the restroom, splashing water on his face. "You don't look well, sir," Anthony said quietly, concerned. Thompson leaned heavily against the sink. "I'll be fine. Just a bug." "I found that Henderson case for you," Anthony said, sliding a folder from his cleaning cart. "And I took the liberty of noting some other relevant precedents." Thompson's eyes widened as he flipped through the pages. "These are excellent notes, better than what my paralegal provided." He looked up at Anthony with newfound respect. "You're not just a janitor, are you?" Anthony gave a small smile. "I clean the floors here, but I also have a law degree." "Then why aren't you—" "It's complicated," Anthony cut him off gently. "But I care about this case. Those are my neighbors. Out there." Thompson nodded, then suddenly gripped the edge of the sink as a wave of dizziness hit him. "I need to sit down." Anthony helped him to a bench in the hallway. Thompson's breathing was labored, and his skin felt hot to the touch. "You need a doctor," Anthony insisted. "I need to finish cross-examining their expert," Thompson argued weakly. "If I don't challenge his testimony about those chemicals—" "I've reviewed his research," Anthony said. "His studies were funded by Chemtech's parent company, and he cherry-picked his data. I found 3 peer-reviewed articles that contradict his findings." Thompson stared at him. "How do you know all this?" "I've been following this situation for years. My uncle died because of their negligence." At that moment, May rounded the corner and rushed to them. "Thompson, you look terrible. I think he needs medical attention," Anthony told her. They called for help, and within minutes, paramedics arrived. As they prepared to take Thompson to the hospital, he grabbed Anthony's arm. "The case," he gasped. "They'll ask for a continuance. Chemtech will use the delay to pressure my clients into a smaller settlement." Anthony and May exchanged looks. "What if someone stepped in for you?" May suggested. "Temporarily." Thompson looked at Anthony, understanding dawning in his fevered eyes. "You'd need to file for appearance." "I'm a member of the bar," Anthony said. "I can file the paperwork today. My briefcase, all the case files were—" "I'll make sure Anthony gets everything," May promised. As the paramedics wheeled Thompson away, May turned to Anthony. "Are you sure about this? Once you step into that courtroom as an attorney, there's no going back to being invisible." Anthony watched through the courthouse windows as his neighbors gathered on the steps outside, many holding signs demanding justice for their community. An elderly woman with an oxygen tank, a father carrying his young daughter who had an inhaler clutched in her small hand. "I'm sure," he said simply. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Anthony took an emergency personal day from his janitorial duties. He filed his appearance as co-counsel with the court clerk, who did a double take at seeing him in street clothes instead of his uniform. May helped him gather Thompson's files and briefed him on procedural details. By evening, Anthony sat at his small desk at home, surrounded by case materials preparing for the next day. His pressed suit hung on the back of his bedroom door, a suit he'd purchased 3 years ago when he passed the bar exam, worn only twice since then. His phone rang. It was Mrs. Patterson, one of the community leaders and a plaintiff in the Yao case. "I just heard about Thompson," she said. "The company lawyers are already talking about delays. Some folks are scared they're going to get away with it again. The case is still moving forward. Anthony assured her. I'll be stepping in while Thompson recovers. A pause. You? But I'm a licensed attorney, Mrs. Patterson, and I grew up drinking the same water you did. After they hung up, Anthony rehearsed his cross-examination of Dr. Reynolds until the words flowed naturally. He reviewed environmental regulations, scientific studies on chemical exposure, and case law until his eyes burned with fatigue. When he finally went to bed in the early morning hours, he set 2 alarms, though he doubted he'd need them. Sleep would be elusive tonight. Just before dawn, Anthony stood before his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie. The man who looked back at him wasn't the courthouse janitor anymore, but he wasn't quite a polished attorney either. He was something in between, someone who understood both worlds and could move between them. As he walked to the courthouse, Anthony's stomach knotted with tension. For 9 years he had moved through these halls unnoticed. Today all eyes would be on him. He arrived early and sat alone in the empty courtroom, feeling the weight of what was about to happen. The bailiff entered to prepare the room and stopped, short when he saw Anthony in a suit instead of a janitor's uniform. Morning. Anthony nodded. The bailiff returned the greeting with a confused expression and went about his duties. Slowly, the courtroom began to fill. The Chemtech lawyers arrived first, clustering at their table with confident smiles, unaware of the change that was coming. Anthony waited in the gallery until he saw his neighbors filing in, the plaintiffs who had entrusted their case to Thompson. Mrs. Patterson spotted him and came over. "You clean up nice," she said with a warm smile. "Thompson always spoke highly of you, but he never mentioned you were a lawyer." "Until yesterday, I was just the janitor here," Anthony admitted. "Well, today, you're our lawyer. And speaking as someone who's watched you grow up, I'd say you were meant for more than pushing a mop." The corporate attorneys were now noticing him, whispering among themselves. One of them approached. "Excuse me," he said, his tone condescending. "The plaintiff's table is reserved for counsel." Anthony smiled politely. "I'm aware. I've filed my appearance as co-counsel for the plaintiffs." The attorney's eyebrows shot up. "You're a lawyer?" "Yes," Anthony replied simply, offering nothing. "More." Before the man could respond, the doors opened and Judge Hartman entered. Everyone rose as the bailiff called the court to order. When the judge took his seat, his eyes scanned the room and froze when they landed on Anthony standing at the plaintiff's table in a suit instead of cleaning the floors. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. The moment of truth had arrived. Anthony took a deep breath as Judge Hartman's gaze bored into him, recognition and disbelief battling in the judge's expression. Anthony stepped forward. "Your Honor," he said, his voice strong and clear despite the hammering of his heart. "Anthony Wilson, appearing as counsel for the plaintiffs." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Hartman's face showed a mixture of confusion and disbelief as he stared at Anthony standing confidently at the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Wilson," the judge said slowly, "I'm going to need to see your credentials." "Yes, Your Honor." Anthony produced his bar card and law degree, handing them to the bailiff who brought them to the bench. The corporate lawyers exchanged worried glances as Judge Hartman examined the documents carefully. The spectators in the gallery whispered among themselves, and Anthony could feel the eyes of his neighbors on his back. "These appear to be in order," Judge Hartman finally said, his voice tight. "However, I'm concerned about this sudden change in counsel. Where is Mr. Thompson?" "Mr. Thompson was taken to county hospital yesterday with what doctors believe is pneumonia, Your Honor," Anthony explained. "I've filed a notice of appearance as co-counsel. Mr. Thompson asked me specifically to continue in his absence to avoid any delays that might disadvantage the plaintiffs." One of the Chemtech attorneys shot to his feet. "Your Honor, we object to this last-minute substitution. We need time to prepare for a new opposing counsel." "Interesting," Anthony replied before the judge could speak. "I've reviewed the court records and Chemtech has changed attorneys 3 times during pretrial motions, each time causing delays. The plaintiffs didn't object to those substitutions." A few chuckles came from the gallery. Judge Hartman's mouth tightened. "Mr. Wilson, Are you prepared to continue with the cross-examination of Dr. Reynolds today? The judge asked. I am, Your Honor. Judge Hartman paused, clearly weighing his options. Any obvious bias would be noted by the reporters present. Very well. The court recognizes Anthony Wilson as counsel for the plaintiffs. Dr. Reynolds, please, retake the stand. The scientist who had testified about the chemical levels returned to the witness stand, looking unconcerned. He had faced many cross-examinations in his career and rarely encountered attorneys who could challenge his scientific credentials. Anthony approached the stand, carrying only a small notepad rather than the stacks of papers the corporate lawyers had. Dr. Reynolds, he began politely, you testified yesterday that the levels of trichloroethylene found in Westbrook's groundwater are below EPA guidelines and therefore safe. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct, the scientist replied confidently. And you base this conclusion on your own 2018 study, Safety Thresholds for Industrial Solvents in Groundwater? Among other peer-reviewed research, yes, Anthony nodded. I'd like to discuss that study. Could you tell the court who funded your research? Dr. Reynolds shifted slightly. It was funded by a scientific grant. From which organization? The National Institute for Chemical Safety. Anthony walked to the plaintiff's table and picked up a document. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence this public records filing showing that the National Institute for Chemical Safety received 85% of its funding from Continental Holdings between 2015 and 2020. He turned back to the witness. Dr. Reynolds, are you aware that Continental Holdings is the parent company of Chemtech Industries? The scientist's confident demeanor faltered. The funding source doesn't affect the scientific methodology. Let's talk about that methodology, Anthony continued, his voice calm but focused. In your study, you tested water samples from 8 different locations. Could you tell the court how you selected those locations? As Dr. Reynolds began explaining his sampling method, Anthony listened carefully, then interrupted with precise questions about statistical validity and sampling bias. With each question, the scientist's answers became more defensive. Dr. Reynolds, are you familiar with the Henderson study published in the Journal of Environmental Toxicology last year? Anthony asked. I've heard of it, but it used a flawed methodology. Flawed in what way? As the scientist began a technical explanation, Anthony calmly dismantled each criticism, showing an understanding of environmental science that surprised everyone in the courtroom. Your Honor, Anthony said, I'd like to enter into evidence 3 peer-reviewed studies that directly contradict Dr. Reynolds' conclusions about safe exposure levels. Unlike his research, none of these studies received funding from chemical companies or their subsidiaries. The judge, who had been watching the exchange with increasing interest, nodded his permission. Anthony then displayed a map of Westbrook showing cancer rates by street, overlaid with groundwater flow patterns from the Chemtech plant. Dr. Reynolds, how do you explain the statistical correlation between proximity to contaminated groundwater and cancer diagnoses if the chemical levels are, as you claim, completely safe? The witness looked at the corporate lawyers for help, but they could only watch as their expert was systematically discredited by a man they'd assumed was just a janitor. By the time Anthony finished his cross-examination, Dr. Reynolds' testimony had been so thoroughly undermined that even Judge Hartman was taking extensive notes. The gallery was completely silent, everyone leaning forward to catch every word. No further questions, Your Honor, Anthony finally said. During the lunch recess, May found Anthony in the courthouse corridor. That was brilliant, she said, eyes shining. You destroyed their key expert. Anthony exhaled slowly, the tension of the morning finally catching up with him. It's not over. They have 3 more witnesses and a lot of resources. But you know their playbook, May pointed out. You've been watching them for years. Nearby, reporters were gathered around Mrs. Patterson and other Westbrook residents. Is it true your attorney used to be the courthouse janitor? One reporter asked. Mrs. Patterson stood tall. Mr. Wilson has been a part of our community his whole life. He understands what we've been through because he's lived it. And if you'd been in that courtroom today, you'd know he's exactly the lawyer we need. Anthony turned away, uncomfortable with the attention. As he headed toward a quiet corner to review his notes for the afternoon session, he found his path, blocked by the lead attorney for Chemtech. "Impressive performance this morning, Wilson," the man said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Our firm is always looking for talented attorneys. After this case is over, we should talk." Anthony studied him for a moment. "I think we have different definitions of justice, Mr. Blake." "Justice doesn't pay the bills," Blake replied. "Our starting salary for associates is 3 times what you're likely to make representing these people." He gestured dismissively toward the Westbrook residence. "These people are my neighbors," Anthony said simply. "I'll see you in court." As he walked away, Anthony noticed Judge Hartman watching the exchange from his chamber doorway. Their eyes met briefly before the judge retreated inside. The afternoon session began with Chemtech calling their next witness, a regulatory compliance officer who testified that the company had met all legal requirements for waste disposal. This time, Anthony was ready with documentation showing inspection reports had been falsified and certain tests never performed. His questioning was precise and relentless, built on years of quiet observation and careful research. As the day ended and court adjourned, reporters swarmed around Anthony. Cameras flashed as he tried to make his way through the crowd. "Mr. Wilson, how does it feel to go from janitor to attorney in this high-profile case? Did you plan this all along? What does Judge Hartman think of your new role given your previous interactions?" Anthony raised his hands. "I'm just doing my job, representing my clients. No further comments." As the crowd dispersed, Anthony found himself alone in the grand hallway of the courthouse, the same hallway he had mopped countless times. He ran his hand along the polished wooden banister that he had dusted every morning for 9 years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Chemtech would regroup overnight, adjust their strategy. But for the first time in years, Anthony felt fully alive, fully himself. The long wait, the careful study, the patient gathering of evidence, it had all been for this moment. Judge Hartman's door opened, and the judge himself stepped out, briefcase in hand. He paused when he saw Anthony. "Mr. Wilson," he said, his tone unreadable. "My chambers 8 a.m. tomorrow before court resumes." Anthony nodded, wondering what the judge had planned. "I'll be there, Your Honor." Anthony arrived at the courthouse the next morning at 7:45, dressed in his suit but carrying a small duffel bag with his janitor's uniform. No matter what happened in court today, he still had a job to do. He'd called his supervisor yesterday to explain his emergency absence, but he couldn't afford to lose his steady paycheck, especially not now. The building was quiet, with only security guards and early arriving clerks present. Anthony took the familiar path to Judge Hartman's chambers, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. He'd walked this hallway thousands of times with his cleaning cart. Today, he carried only a briefcase. He knocked on the heavy wooden door. "Enter," came the judge's voice. Anthony stepped inside. Judge Hartman sat behind his large desk, not in his robes, but in a crisp shirt and tie. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the law books lining the walls, books Anthony had dusted weekly for years. "Mr. Wilson," the judge said, gesturing to a chair, "please sit." Anthony took the offered seat, keeping his expression neutral. He'd learned long ago to hide his thoughts when dealing with those in power. "I've spent most of the night reviewing your credentials," Judge Hartman began. "State University Law School, graduated with honors, passed the bar exam on your first attempt 3 years ago. Yet you continued working as a janitor in this courthouse." It wasn't a question, but Anthony answered anyway. "Yes, Your Honor." "Why?" The judge's piercing eyes studied him. "You could have gone to any number of firms. Your academic record is excellent." Anthony considered his response carefully. "I had something to learn that law school couldn't teach me." "And what was that?" "How justice really works. Not just the law as written in books, but how it's applied, who it serves and who it fails." Judge Hartman leaned back in his chair. "And what have you concluded from your observations?" "That the system works differently depending on who you are and what resources you have," Anthony said evenly. but also that it can work as intended when people of conscience insist on it. The judge's expression was unreadable. People of conscience, he repeated softly. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the courthouse steps where protesters from Westbrook were already gathering, their signs visible from above. I've been offered a position on the federal bench, Judge Hartman said unexpectedly. The announcement was supposed to come next week. Anthony remained silent, sensing there was more. The Chemtech case is complicated for my prospects, the judge continued. There are powerful interests watching how I handle it. I'm aware, Anthony replied. Continental Holdings made significant donations to several senators on the Judicial Confirmation Committee. Judge Hartman turned, eyebrows raised. You've done your research. It's been a long 9 years of watching and learning, Your Honor. The judge returned to his desk. Yesterday in court you were impressive. The Henderson precedent you mentioned. The other day, you were right about it. I know. I've been thinking about our first encounter, Judge Hartman said, his voice quieter now. About what I said to you. Anthony remembered the mockery, the laughter. You suggested I should stick to what I know. That was inexcusable. On my part, the judge admitted. It reflected prejudices I didn't realize I still carried. Anthony studied the man's face, seeing genuine regret there. We all have blind spots, Your Honor. Some more damaging than others, Judge Hartman replied. He picked up a document from his desk. Chemtech's attorneys have filed a motion to have me recused from this case due to prior interaction with opposing counsel, meaning you. On you. What grounds? They're claiming I showed bias against you which could now prejudice me in your favor as I attempt to compensate. Anthony couldn't help but smile slightly at the irony. Creative approach. Indeed, the judge agreed. They're desperate after your performance yesterday, but here's my question for you, Mr. Wilson. Should I recuse myself? Anthony hadn't expected this. Are you asking for my legal opinion or my personal one? Both. Anthony took a moment to gather his thoughts. Legally, the interaction doesn't rise to the standard required for recusal. It was regrettable but not something that would prevent you from ruling fairly. And personally? Personally, Anthony said, looking directly at the judge. I think running from difficult truths rarely leads to growth. For any of us. Judge Hartman held his gaze, then nodded slowly. Court begins in 1 hour. I'll see you there, counselor. As Anthony left the chambers, he felt the weight of what was to come. The case would only get harder, with Chemtech bringing their full resources to bear. But something had shifted in the balance of power. When court convened, Judge Hartman announced his decision to remain on the case, denying Chemtech's motion for recusal. The corporate lawyers looked grim as the judge also ruled that Anthony's evidence about the funding of Dr. Reynolds's research would be admitted. For the next 3 days, Anthony presented the plaintiff's case with a clarity and passion that captivated the courtroom. He called residents of Westbrook to testify about their illnesses. He presented maps showing the spread of contamination. He questioned Chemtech's own employees, many of whom he knew from his childhood in the neighborhood. On the final day, as both sides prepared for closing arguments, Anthony received an unexpected message. Thompson, the original lawyer, had been released from the hospital and wanted to attend. When the older attorney arrived, still looking pale but determined, Anthony offered to let him deliver the closing. No, Thompson said, gripping Anthony's shoulder. This is your case now. You've earned it. Anthony stood before the jury, aware of the packed gallery behind him, his neighbors, reporters, the courthouse staff who had walked past him for years without really seeing him. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, this case is about more than chemicals in water. It's about what we owe each other as human beings sharing the same community. His voice grew stronger as he continued, walking the jury through the evidence without notes or prompts. He spoke about his uncle who had died of cancer, about children playing in contaminated soil, about corporate executives who knew the dangers but chose profit over safety. Chemtech's attorneys will tell you they followed regulations, Anthony said. But following the bare minimum of the law while knowing the harm you're causing isn't justice. It's just finding the loopholes in decency. When he finished, and returned to his seat, Mrs. Patterson squeezed his hand. "No matter what happens," she whispered, "you've already won something important for us." The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning their verdict. Chemtech was liable for contaminating Westbrook's water. The award to the plaintiffs was significant, enough to provide medical monitoring for the community and to help families who needed to relocate. Outside the courthouse, as reporters thrust microphones toward him, Anthony deflected questions about his unusual journey. "This victory belongs to the people of Westbrook who refuse to give up," he said simply. "They're the ones who deserve your attention." Later that evening, after the celebrations had died down, Anthony found himself back at the courthouse. He changed into his janitor's uniform and began his regular cleaning routine, starting with the lobby and working his way up to the courtrooms. Judge Hartman, leaving late, found Anthony mopping the hallway outside his chambers. "You're still working as a janitor?" the judge asked, surprised. Anthony looked up from his work. "For now. It's honest work that pays the bills while I figure out my next steps." "And what might those be?" "I'm thinking of opening a small practice in Westbrook," Anthony replied. "People, they need legal help with all sorts of things, not just big cases like this one." Judge Hartman nodded thoughtfully. "The law needs more people who understand both sides of the courthouse." Anthony leaned on his mop. "Everyone has value and something to contribute, Your Honor. Sometimes we just need to look past the uniform to see it." "A lesson I won't forget," the judge said quietly. He extended his hand. "Good luck, Counselor Wilson." Anthony shook it, the gesture marking a new equality between them. As Judge Hartman walked away, Anthony returned to his mopping with the same care he always showed, moving methodically down the hallway. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions. But tonight, in the quiet of the empty courthouse, he felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that he had used his knowledge and patience to bring a measure of justice to his community. He had stepped out of the shadows when it mattered most, revealing not just his legal mind but the power that comes from understanding both worlds, those who make the rules and those who live with their consequences.